All right.
Okay, red light means go. Hey, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the April installment of 1455's monthly author series. This month, we are delighted, and it's very appropriate for National Poetry Month, to welcome the poet Danielle Badra. I will introduce her formally in a second. Let me just begin by saying, if this is your first time joining us, please feel warmly welcome. I'm grateful that you're here. I hope you enjoy and spread the word. I'm Sean Murphy. I'm the founding director of 1455, and very briefly, our mission is quite simple and transparent. We are a nonprofit arts organization, and our mission and glory is to celebrate storytelling, and we always are trying to find avenues to showcase storytellers. We do this via all of our free programming, which includes this author series. We have an interview series. We have a bi-monthly publication called Movable Type that incorporates everything from poetry and prose to visual art, photography, music, etc. And we have our annual summer festival, which is officially open for proposals and submissions. You can find out a lot more about all of this at 1455litarts.org, and I welcome you to check that out. Also, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our great friends and co-sponsors at DC's historic Potter's House. We do all of these events in conjunction with them, and we make all the books that we talk about available via their online bookstore. A few words about the Potter's House. They are a nonprofit cafe, bookstore, and event space in the Adams Morgan neighborhood of DC. And since 1960, they've been a key place for deeper conversation, creative expression, and community transformation. We encourage you to support them. Check them out online, or if you live in DC, stop by their amazing facility. And I'm really happy to say that we are tentatively stepping toward whatever we're going to call the new normal, and we are planning to have some live events with 1455 and Potter's House. So stay tuned for that. Okay. Tonight's special guest, I am very excited, and we have had this in the books since last year, so I've really been looking forward patiently, but it's also provided me a chance to read the book several times. Let me introduce the poet, Danielle Badra. She is a queer Arab American poet. She was raised in Michigan and currently resides in Virginia. Her debut collection, Like We Still Speak, was selected as the winner of the 2021 Etel Adnan Poetry Prize and is published through the University of Arkansas Press. Danielle, welcome. It's a real joy to have you here tonight.
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to the Potter's House as well. I'm a big fan. I used to visit the Potter's House regularly when I was a dog walker in DC. So
it's such a great space, and we've really leaned into the virtual aspect, and how inclusive that makes things. But I think we would agree that there's nothing quite like artists gathering in real time and sharing community in real space. So really excited to have that as a possibility as we go forward. So before we talk about this collection and have you read from it, I want to read one of the many blurbs from the excellent, amazing poet, Diane Seuss. She writes, Danielle Badra's Like We Still Speak is both pristine and audacious. Pristine in its acute responsiveness to the subjects at hand, profound loss, staggering grief, and overarching love, and audacious in its courage to still speak in contrapuntal braiding with the voices of the dead. These poems reveal a dynamic collaboration with the living and the dead in English, in Arabic, with other writers, artists, parents, friends, and most potently, the poet's sister, Rachel. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It could be Rachel. I'll let you.
It is Rachel.
Poet's sister, Rachel, so I'm 0 for 2 on pronunciation, who compels these exquisite formal innovations. She concludes by saying, there's an inclusiveness, elegant defiance beyond anything I've ever read. I agree heartily and couldn't have said it as well as her, so I'm glad to read that. Danielle, talk a little bit about what prompted this collection and when you just introduce the piece, and then we'll turn the mic over to you.
All right. Well, thank you. Yeah, so I started to write Like We Still Speak shortly after my sister passed away, which was 10 years ago in February. When she was in the hospital, I actually found a black moleskin book in her purse where she had written several poems. And I didn't know she was writing poems at the time. And I went on to discover a number of poems of hers in a yellow folder that was in her bookshelf after she passed. I inherited all of her things. And when I found, more and more and more poems on her laptop, poems, just everywhere. I knew I needed to do something with those poems. They weren't necessarily publishable in the form that they were in at the time. And so I had the thought to write alongside them. And in so doing, not only could I potentially get her words published, but I could also have this conversation with her that I really needed to have. That, she died very suddenly. When I was 25, she was 28. She had an undiagnosed genetic heart condition that, we did none of us knew this was going to happen. And so I had a lot of lingering questions that I wanted answered, and talking to her through her poems ended up becoming a very therapeutic, obsessive act of mine. I didn't even know that the contrapuntal form existed at the time, and that that's what I was doing. For me, it was just creating a dialogue with my dead. And so that's where the book started. And then when I was in the MFA program, I was challenged to break away from my obsessive writing with my sister and, try writing with others, or writing on my own, or writing in different forms with my sister or without my sister, and just kind of expand the different ways of having conversation, and which is something I'm really invested in as a writer, is inviting other voices into the work. And so that's what it has expanded to be. I've got my mom, my dad, my sister, my wife, my friends, my favorite poets, artists. They all make an appearance in the book. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many things I want to ask and talk about. But yeah, I would say for sure, for those of you watching that are coming to this, it's a very conversational collection. To use Dostoevsky term, it's very dialogic in the sense that it does contain a lot of these voices in a very purposeful and moving way. So what better way to acquaint us with this work than to have the poet read from it? If you would be so kind, I would be delighted to hear this.
Okay, you got it. Well, I figured it would be fitting to start with a contrapuntal poem, which, for those of you who don't know what the form is, it's typically 2 columns, and you can read each column as its own poem, or alongside, from left to right as a third poem. So this is an image of what it would look like. So I'm going to read an entire universe, and my sister's words are on the left, and then mine are on the right. I'm going to read hers and then mine, and then both of them together. So an entire universe. I thought of how at that moment I realized I was crying while smiling. Your voice, I listened to it lilt. I lost an entire universe. Worlds crumble without oxygen into scattered asteroid belts. Comets burn on impact. I am somehow still alive. I thought of your voice, how I listened to it lilt. At that moment, I lost an entire universe. I realized worlds crumble. I was without oxygen, crying into scattered asteroid belts. While comets burn on impact, I am smiling. I am somehow smiling, still alive. So that is an entire universe. And I'm going to switch to a poem that does not incorporate any of my sister's words, but still incorporates her in some ways. So, and actually the cover image from the book was kind of inspired by this poem, an image in it. So this is Ode to Onion. Onion is the only thing I want to eat. My great uncle ate raw onion dipped in sugar for lunch. When my tears are meant for my ancestors, I'm more Lebanese than Michigander. My tears taste like red onion salt water. I lick them from my hands, a favorite meal. A meal I've shared with my sister before in a pillow fort. She cooked more often than me. I always did the dishes in the evening once the sun set. It is easier to focus on the moon crest out the kitchen window. I prefer the light of the moon to other forms of far light. If light must be distant, let it be moonlight. Flashlights in the coat closet, shadow puppets across a backlit wall. We were static after rubbing ears with withering minks. We were learning to curate our own culture. I'll read just two more and then we can jump into conversation.
Great.
So this next one is a station poem, and there are several station poems throughout the book. There were originally 14 station poems when I started the station project, and they were based on my father's Stations of the Cross mass that he would deliver at our Catholic church every Good Friday. And since Good Friday is coming up, I figured I will read some of these station poems. So this is the station on page 41 of the book. And I want to show it to you as well, because it does take an interesting form. And for those who haven't realized this yet, I like to give the reader the option to read in multiple directions. And this poem you can actually read, I'll show it to you. It's kind of like a triangle. The lines are there because you can actually read it top to bottom like that, or top to bottom, bottom to top, or just across like there's lots of ways you can read it, but I like reading it top to bottom. So this is station on page 41. When Aunt Mary was born, her mother, a woman with scarred olive branch arms, loathed her for having father's face, a man with an insatiable taste for olives. Loathed Joudah for forcing mother's hand in something mother knew nothing good about. Holy matrimony before age 18, when the highest form of luxury was love. Father found mother stuffing grape leaves. Whatever mother lauded, she lost at conception. Mother never wanted his weighty fingers. Whatever mother longed for was forbidden. Holding her family's food the wrong way. Father had what mother deserved too. Eating the excess rice and raw meat, father got what he desired every time. Onions dipped in sugar. So it is a little disorienting reading it from top to bottom, but that is my favorite way for reading it and ending it. So, but you can choose your own adventure with that one. And then the last poem I'll read before we jump into a conversation is Child of the Universe. And I wrote this one in response to a piece of art that my friend Joudah Rezapour created. And I originally wrote it for the children of Aleppo, but I've been reading it lately at readings for the children of Ukraine. So this is for them. Child of the Universe. I can't dry your tears. I can't find your mother in the crystal rubble. I can't cradle her cracked skull. I can't shield your doe eyes from shrapnel. I can't soothe your skin from white phosphorus blooms. I can't keep you as my own. I can't make you leave Aleppo. I can't smuggle you out of scorched streets. I can't teach you the constellations through smoke plumes. I can't reveal your fate at the bottom of a broken teacup. I can't control your seasoned screams or even fetch a pail of water. I can't sing you a lullaby to the unsteady beat of barrel bombs. I can't tell you to close your eyes as I can't close mine either. I can't bake baklava for you without orange blossom water and walnuts. I can't cook rice for you without controlled flames, or give you sweets without bees, without flowers, without hives, pour milk without an udder, a breast, or formula. I can't promise you will survive to write poems and not be bitter. I can't paint a peaceful scene for you if war never ends. I can't stop the sky falling. I can't stop the rain stinging your open wounds. I can't dull the blinding sun or kill for you. I can't comb your dusty hair, tie your tattered shoes, replace the love that once held you, collage your face into a portrait. I can't face your infinite stare. I can't hand you some sugar, some rocks. This distance is not light years, but oceans, and yet I can't reach you this year or the next.
Wow. Thank you for that. I mean, preparing for this conversation was really a pleasure. I have so many thoughts, so many questions, but I think it's appropriate for me to just thank you. I was really honored to kind of immerse myself in this work, and I think it's work that really obliges, especially real lovers of poetry. It's at once challenging and accessible. It's far-ranging. And it's immediately something that anyone plugged into contemporary, society will immediately relate to. So it exists on a lot of different levels. For me personally, obviously there are so many purposes of poetry that we could talk about. But to me, I think at its best, poetry's highest calling is preserving our shared humanity. And that includes, of course, elegizing lives of loved ones that are no longer with us. And certainly on a variety of levels, this collection does that throughout.
Yes, yes, it does.
So to elaborate on that thought, which will lead to a question, grieving is different than creating, although they're ceaselessly intertwined, right? I think the best writing about these topics is never personal grief on the page, but something that keeps memory alive in the art and also helps serve as a guide of sorts for those who have not yet experienced a profound personal loss. Do you agree with that, or what are your thoughts about the notion of dealing with grief and loss as a through line of a work?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that. Well, so I definitely feel like I use poetry as a way to remember my lost ones, because over time, anyone who has experienced grief, like their voice becomes less, you don't hear it as much, and some of the memories start to fade. And it's these things that especially for loved ones that you lose who maybe mean a lot more, ones that really, like if you were like upset at somebody, you probably wouldn't try to elegize them in the same way that I have in this book, right? But for these people who really meant so much to me, the memories of them, even in small ways, I guess, I don't know if I'm answering this quite well. What I'm trying to say is that writing, at least for me, was the best form of grieving. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think what I'm trying to say, and I think you're articulating it wonderfully, is grief or life is it couldn't be more profoundly personal experience. But what I think art does in general, and poetry in particular, is, and for those, as an advocate for the art form, I'm always trying to make this art form more accessible and less scary for those who think that it requires an advanced degree to understand. I think what poetry does when it's operating on powerful levels is articulate and explore things that are very unique through the eye of the poet, and they use their own style to convey that. But we're talking about things that we all can relate to. And I think poetry, perhaps more than any other art form, can do that in such a succinct fashion. And it's incumbent upon the author to find the right images and find the right strategy to get that emotion across. And again, I want to kind of high five you for consistently achieving that through all these poems, which take a lot of different forms and shift around in time and subject matter.
Thank you. Yeah. Like, I guess, you know, the image of me and my sister playing in our grandmother's closet, making shadow puppets on the wall, you know, even though that's a very particular image to me and my own experience with my sister, it's something that others could see and have, you know, relatable experiences and understand in that moment what I lost. So I feel like that is exactly what you are explaining. And yes.
Well, and so as someone who I lost my mother at a too young age, so certainly I think I'm certain these poems acquit themselves wonderfully, period. But for me personally, there were definitely extra layers of kind of appreciation, seeing someone be able to so beautifully elegize and celebrate the love of you know, someone that has been lost. But for those that haven't experienced it, and again, I think this collection is such a good gateway to that kind of potential healing. What people might not understand is that when we lose a loved one that we have that's inextricable from our own personal history, we don't see them in kind of a single snapshot. They exist as they were, as they are in our memory, as they may have been if they had lived, and then the very kind of surreal and unsettling, but also deeply beautiful world of dreams.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I completely agree. When we make up, you know, memories, I've heard different things from like different psychology books about memory, but you know, it's a lot of the imagined, really. There's something of what actually happened, but a lot of it is what we imagine or make up about what happened, you know, because we can't remember an exact moment.
Right. And maybe talk a little bit more about that, because I think for people that aren't artists watching this, that's a really fascinating, like, how do you do what you do and why do you do what you do? When to me, this is great. Like, this is 101 material in the sense that, okay, so the thesis, we are at least ostensibly talking about a sister who lost her beloved sister way too young and is processing that grief, making art out of these memories. But what's your jumping in point, and how did you balance the desire to remember her, but also express your own, you know, grief and your own feelings? You know, it's a very personal book. You know, you balance the ability to paint these pictures, make your sister come to life, but you're also, of course, always using your own, you know, powers.
So honestly, when Rachel died, one of the biggest things that I grieved beyond just like, you know, her as a whole person was the fact that her memory was impeccable. She could remember everything. And I had always anticipated her being the person who stored all of our childhood memories into the future. Like, I would be like, Rachel, do you remember this one thing? And she would know, and I would not remember it at all. So when she passed, I felt like I lost like my Google data warehouse of a human who like knew all of these memories from our childhood. Like, I'd lost all of those memories. And so a lot of why I would use her poems as well to have these conversations is because some of those memories were preserved in her poems. Some of those poems helped me remember. Yeah.
So I'm curious, did you know, you said you didn't know she'd written these particular poems, but did you know she wrote poetry at all?
Yeah, so
Okay.
when we went to the same undergrad, Kalamazoo College, which was where Diane Seuss taught, which is why, yeah, I know that her blurb and everything. Anyways,
Mhm.
so we were both. She was Di's student first because she was older than me, and she had written some poems in her class that she'd share with me when I was in high school, and then when I got into college and I was in Di's classes as well. We were sharing poems with each other at the time. And I don't know when she stopped sharing them with me or why. Some of her friends said after her passing that she had felt like intimidated by my poetry at one point, and that's why she stopped sharing with me. But I really wish I both wish she had continued to share with me, but at the same time, I guess I'm grateful that I had all these words of hers defined after she passed as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's to me, it's astonishing also that two sisters that were obviously so close were also both artistic. And yeah, I mean, the way that I think it's very potentially risky to do what you did. So kudos for, I mean, it works, but
Yeah.
it doesn't just work. It doesn't just clear the bar. It adds such a layer, especially for this type of theme of, again, grieving and remembering and eulogizing, celebrating. There's such an extra emotional weight by bringing her literally into the poems. So you already did some of my work for me by reading one of the poems and showing it, but I want to talk a little bit more, put our craft hats on, because this collection, and again, for those of you that haven't seen it yet, is most definitely not page after page of 8 to 10 to 20 lines of poetry. A lot of them look differently. They read differently on the page, and I'm fascinated by that. I think it's such an interesting kind of narrative strategy. I would love you to talk a little bit about the way the poems breathe on the page, and the way that you use your deployment of space. The cumulative effect of that is that space starts to take on its own voice in a way. Talk a little bit about craft. Let's get nerdy for a minute.
Okay. So that's definitely something I learned in Di Seuss's classes, actually, was how to use the blank space on a page. And from very early in my writing career in undergrad, I would create these poems that took on their own form and broke out of the square mold. And I was always very interested in creating like images with my words, because I've never been able to draw or paint. I'm not very good at that, but I could write, and I could sometimes make the words look like things too. But even beyond that, especially with the contrapuntal poems, and some of them, have 3 columns instead of 2 columns. One of the poems, the Phillips collection, has a middle poem and a frame poem that goes around it. That was really brought on, when I was in the MFA and I was challenged to break out of the obsessive form that I wrote like 400 contrapuntal poems in like 2 years. Because I was grieving and my grief was coming out in these contrapuntal poems. And that I was really challenged. They said, this is great what you're doing. It's very interesting. It's very, there's a lot here, but can you change this form? How can you innovate it? How can you stretch this form? Make it do more work for you, or make, what else can you do with this, essentially? And that's, I think, where I really found the avenue into it. Some of these poems I used to have them with like italicized within the text, because the words would kind of like weave into a typical block of poems. But I removed the italicized text when publishing, per my editor's suggestion, in order to make all of the words kind of blend together. But anywho,
No, thank you for that. Thank you for that explanation. And I'm curious, both in terms of your own work going forward, how this will play into kind of your ongoing kind of attack, the mechanics of your strategy. But also, when you read, I'm curious, like when you read other poems now, do you find yourself as an editor saying or thinking, this could use a little space, or this would be more powerful if, because I do think that this is I won't say a more contemporary, evolution of the form, but certainly it's more, I think, widespread to not just see the classic boxed poem. But what do you think when you see do you find that certain poetry, either past or even in the present, would benefit from some of this?
Yeah, I mean, I do. And also, see, what I end up usually doing is when I'll come across a poem that is like almost getting to the contrapuntal stage where they've got like some interesting spacing on the page, but I can't really figure out what the purpose is of that spacing. That's when I get like really like, oh, there could be real purpose to this, but I just don't see it. Yeah.
Yeah, and for me, whenever I see anything, for lack of a better cliche, out of the norm or out of the standard, out of the cliche, the first thing I think my instinctive editor's mind or writer's mind or reader's mind asks is this serving the poem?
Yeah.
And I'm happy to concede there very likely are times where I'm just not getting it, but I know it is a big turnoff for me if I'm seeing liberties taken that aren't earned.
Yeah.
And I know there's a fine line. I mean, any poet can and should do whatever they need to do, but I think it's safe to say that what you're doing is very deliberate. And as I've already said, in my estimation, and obviously several others from the blurbs, you have used these strategies very effectively, and it has enhanced the way the poems read.
Yeah. And that's, the whole intention, especially for the multi-columnar and, the ones that you can read in multiple directions. I was trying to also be able to guide the reader to read in all the different directions to say, hey, there's something more to this. Keep digging, and don't just read it from left to right, because there are other ways to read it. Yeah.
Yeah, I might have said earlier, and if I didn't, I'll just repeat it. These poems, many of these poems oblige a reread. And I really appreciate that the way you do that is neither cute nor needy. They demand to be met on their own terms, and then that rewards, and I would say that to anyone, by the way, that is kind of getting into poetry or trying to access poetry. Think about, like, how often do you hear a song and you're like, I get it, I'm good. It's after repeated listenings that you pick up on what the musician's trying to do. I think poetry works the same way. It requires repeated readings to see how the language is being used and what choices are being made. What choices aren't.
A really great way to put it. That's a really great way to put it. Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, and the other thing that I feel an affinity to you and an appreciation. It's often said, speaking of cliches, it's often said, I think it's like a shorthand, way of getting around this. Poetry is meant to be read, and I don't disagree with that whatsoever. In fact, we're proving tonight, hearing the artist read in their own voice is an irreplaceable exchange. However, I do believe that certain types of poets or poems, frankly, do need to be read and are written as such. What I want to call out in your work, Danielle, is these poems, as we're hearing, work. They read well. But I think these are poems that need to fully be savored by reading them on the page.
Yeah. Well, and it's kind of fun too, because you get out of it from whichever way you enter into it, and the fact that can change. I don't know. I think it's fun for the reader. I hope.
Well, I think it's a generous approach to the craft, because I think if one writes work that can be appreciated fully by being read, that's powerful. But work that there's an intimacy of inviting the reader in and saying, you're going to have an experience here. Yeah. This could go in any number of directions, and you're going to bring something to the table as well.
Yeah, you're part of this. You're part of this conversation.
Yeah. It's a dialogue.
Yeah.
All right, so we've talked high level, we've talked craft. Now we're going to get into the nitty gritty, if that's okay.
Okay.
I'm gonna throw some lines at you that really jumped off the page at me, and you are welcome to either expound on them, explain them, or read from the poem itself.
Okay.
I have a handful of these but one that I think I'm certain it works. Period. Full stop. But as someone that lost a mother at a too young age, I can relate to this line, and I think it goes very deep in terms of what you're achieving, which is sleepless, terrified, I'm next in line. I certainly can attest to the truth of this, the fear, the foreboding, and sometimes that irrational. I think if we've lost someone, it conditions us to have a closer relationship with what death means, especially an untimely death.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I was actually like told the same week my sister was in the hospital after they had declared her brain dead, that essentially I had a 50% chance of developing the same exact thing that she died of. So I literally could not sleep for quite some time afterwards. But yes, I mean it's translatable though to other experiences of loss, and that, especially once a parent dies, you are next.
Right.
In that generational, in that line.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that you pulled from that poem, slowly counting down from 10 while taking deep breaths, which takes several different forms in the book, because of all the different ways it can be read. And I really transformed it in those different ways throughout the book so that I would to encourage those multiple readings, essentially. Yeah.
You mentioned your father. There's another line that I love. It's so sad. It's so gorgeous. It's everything. But the line is, every day, well, blah, blah, dot, 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 that death will be a warm reunion whenever he's ready. Obviously speaking about your father, thinking about your sister or your sister's spirit conveying, but be a warm reunion whenever he's ready. There's just something so powerful about that image.
Thank you. Yeah, I wrote that poem while my father was still going through the months leading up to his death, essentially, which his death was the second most impactful after my sister. And it was really an alarming experience. And I'm glad that I wrote this poem during the time, because I don't think I could have written it after, really. I think I had to write it while he was dying.
Yeah.
Because it was just very startling to experience grief while he was still alive, as compared to my sister dying so quickly. Like, I didn't even have time to start grieving her while she was in the hospital,
Right.
So yeah, glad that you pointed to that poem as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then yet another line that taken out of it's a great line, but taken out of the context of the poem it appears in, but also in the context of this collection, it packs quite a wallop. And the line is, "I lost an entire universe."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, to me, right, that speaks to someone that can't be replaced, that's no longer here, and the inevitable longing, regret, anger, survivor's guilt, the whole range, everything.
Yeah. Well, and when you think about, each one of us is our own universe, really, and especially someone who is that close. I mean, she and I were, I said when she died, it's like I lost half of myself. And that poem is one of the ones that is closest to me, to my heart. So
Yeah, that's very easy for me to believe.
Yeah.
Okay, so Another thing I admire about the best poetry is that it can and does condense entire lives, full novels into a few crucial images. I would love you to read another station poem, the one on page 24, that features your grandfather, because I think it does exactly that. We get so much in such a short span of space.
Yeah, I'll do just that.
Thank you.
All right, so this is the station on page 24. Grandmother helped me realize we are meant to be carriers of light, not bearers of darkness. Who mourned Lebanon and innocence, the smell of thyme and sesame slow roasting in the oven. The smile on my face before communion wafers and wine, reminiscent of her Last Supper in Upper Galilee, where figs were sticky when ripe and fish was blackened on both sides, and she ate the eyes first. She sold her gold wedding ring to pay back debtors during the Great Depression. Grandfather laid car parts for Oldsmobile in Lansing to feed his family. He dreamed of Greater Syria and the streets of Aleppo, where he gave milk to strangers under full moonlight.
What a beautiful, devastating poem that is. Can you talk just a little bit about what inspired that?
Yeah, so again, pulling from my father's stations, he kind of had these, short lines that he would have other people come up and read before his full, station that he would give. And I went through each of them and I pulled text from there. So the first line, grandmother helped me realize we are meant to be carriers of light, not bearers of darkness. I used that line. That was the we are meant to be carriers of light, not bearers of darkness, was from one of his stations. And so I used that as a point to enter into the poem. And what I was trying to do with the whole collection was explore his experience with his family growing up as, this first generation of immigrants in Michigan, and what their experience was like, and what his parents went through he was born during the Great Depression. And so I was really trying to imagine their world and create that out of this idea of being carriers of light in these dark times. So yeah, that's how the poem came to be.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. So getting back to grief, my personal feeling, which I'm certain, I'm certain is not an original thought. But speaking of grief and those who experience it, I feel like, among many other things grief does, it presents us with a choice, which is either to shut down emotionally for a variety of understandable reasons, or in some, I think it expands our capacity to feel, expands our ability to love. I feel like, sensitive people, artists in particular, are inclined to the latter. But there's one line, one of my favorite lines in the collection, that says, "Let's stay hurtable rather than hard." And I'd like you to talk about that, but I adore the line. And I think it functions really as a mission statement for art making, not to mention kind of living an evolved life.
Yeah. Yes, well, I agree. I mean, what all is there to say really about that, other than, by staying hurtable, even though, it means you're going to experience pain, that also means you're going to experience joy, it also means you're going to experience everything in between. Whereas if you, embrace that hardness instead, chances are you're going to shut out those other emotions too, and so I find it, at least personally, better to stay hurtable. I would much rather be able to feel that pain than not. So,
it hurts to be human, but it also means we're capable of that joy and that love. And I think this collection is really kind of a guide of sorts for those that need to navigate that decision, that dilemma of how to handle hurt and anger and injustice, and you're pulling in current events as well as your own family history, again, are things that all of us can relate to. And I think perhaps I also like to think that much work, not all of it, right? Because some people write the right things at the wrong time and vice versa, but work finds its time. And in a world right now where there is so much anger and confusion, it's always been thus, but right now you cannot look at the news without kind of feeling a certain outrage and maybe despondency. To me, it's always nice to be reminded in beautiful words why it matters that we're human and can be hurt.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and especially, being Arab American and there being a continuous history of um, violence across the Middle East. It's something that will always be contemporary. I feel like, at least within Arab and Arab American writing and art, in that there will be this discussion of injustice in some way. So
Yeah.
it felt necessary to speak to that. Yeah.
Right on. There are two other poems I want to call attention to. Ode to Honey exemplifies what certain types of poem can do, which is prompting epiphany. We talked about this earlier as it relates to the form, but in this case, it's really the text itself taking us down one road of expectation and then walloping us with the pure power of memory and metaphor. Curious if you wouldn't mind reading that one.
Yeah, I will. That was actually one of the ones I considered opening with as well, but decided to. So I'm glad you've asked me to read it now.
Excellent. So. Well, I'm delighted that you're willing to read it.
Yeah. So this is Ode to Honey, and it's kind of a pairing with the Ode to Onion that I read during the opening. But Ode to Honey. Honey ends up in my hair even after I've licked my fingers clean. Peanut butter and honey sandwiches were all that I would eat in elementary school. My first day of kindergarten, I was stung by a bee on my hand after eating a PB&H. For robbing its hive and leaving remnants of mischief on my small palms. Red-handed and throbbing, I entered my first day of school tearful and full of guilt. I crushed and killed it as it stung me for stealing from its glistening hive. My fingers curved inward toward the middle of my palm as a reflex, as a defense. The stinger was stuck when I first raised my hand for permission to be excused. The school nurse had a comfortable cot I escaped to when I was feeling overly stimulated. After a certain age, I didn't speak much about what happened to my swollen hive. Not even my sister knew until I was 17 and invited to take back the night. We sat side by side on a stage at Bronson Park where we used to take field trips. We found burial mounds there and shared our family's secret. Our family's secret is orange blossom scented, sticky, bitter, and it stings in the palm.
I mean, that's a pretty devastating, but beautiful rendering of some pain.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. And there's a few poems in here that kind of speak to that same experience that I tend to actually avoid in readings, I guess, because of the vulnerability of them, but I always appreciate when they are requested because
oh good.
Yeah.
Because I was very cognizant of that very thing, which is why I wanted to make it a point to ask you. I wanted to read that, but also again, I mean, I think it's subtle enough in its way that even I think that's another poem that the reader has to earn understanding, and not to say that it's not inaccessible, but I don't think a casual reading of that would register. And I think power, as I mentioned, is those last, the way the poem turns a little bit obliges an immediate reread. which is such a gift to the reader, right? To again, well, let me, shame on me for what I'm about to say, to use honey instead of vinegar to attract, whatever that cliche is, but to entice, as opposed to confuse, where someone says, I'm going to read that again. It's a form of craft that novices cannot pull off. Simply put.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, and it's at least I've found in my own experience, and I feel like it is true just from having been a poetry editor before as well, and reading several submissions, that it is difficult to write about sexual assault in a way that doesn't just wallop you over the head, with these same images, or something that you're not just, it's just hard. It's just hard to write about that experience in a way that readers will really get. I don't know. It's hard to explain.
It is
one of the hardest things to write about, in my opinion.
Well, I think it is, and that and for poetry that will endure, it warrants that level of attention and care. And I think I'm sure you've experienced this, in your own capacity as an editor. Writers have to learn, whether they have the opportunity to be in workshops or just through reading and practice, that just because something happened and it's deeply felt does not mean it's good writing. And I'm always reminded of Orwell in his famous essay, Why I Write. He boils it down to, for me, into one sentence: is don't use images that you've read before. It's like so simple, so difficult, because we're using words, and there's always so many words in the dictionary. But what we do with those words and the way that we awaken fresh images that remind us of what we already know, that's what I mean when I say you have to wallop of emotional import that you seem to specialize in, which again, I want to hasten to add, is not something that one just kind of learns to do instinctively. It takes a lot of practice.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah. So I'm cognizant of the time. We definitely have enough time. I want to thank you for expanding my own kind of vocabulary and knowledge. I would love you to first talk a little bit about what a ghazal is, and then if you would read Ghazal for Lost Women, which is just magnificent.
Sure. So not to call out mispronunciation.
Please do. I actually looked it up. And that's what it said.
Okay. I've always known it as a guzzle, but ghazal, I guess potato.
No, you're the professor, I'm the pupil.
Yeah. So it's a Persian poetry form. And typically the poet would end each sentence. It would be a form of couplets, series of couplets. And at the end of each couplet, you would repeat the same word. And then somewhere in the poem, you would also insert your last name, actually, usually, but you can't submit poems and have your last name in there because you're specifically told not to. So
right.
Anyway, so my last name is not in here, but otherwise I've, for the most part, followed the form. There are other rules to it, especially like if you're following it as writing it in Persian, or in Farsi, you're gonna have different rules, but I'm writing in English. So, okay, so this is Ghazal for Lost Women. Under the harvest moon, there is always a camel, and the camel is always a far lost woman. Lost to the world she once inhabited of red wine and unleavened wafers. Woman, wafting scent of orange blossom seeping from attar syrup cooled on the kitchen counter. Counter to the culture of her mother who baked with anise seeds instead of walnuts. She walled herself inside her fearful heritage when the once world's center certainly collapsed. Collapsing her English into Arabic attempts for fresh watermelon. Batih, woman, batih, her favorite word to pronounce when she was unfamiliar with phlegmy letters. Let her return to the camel, and the camel return to her, a sense of discomfort, like the day she hid beneath pines playing with the boy next door, a game that made her feel monstrous. The monsters under her mattress were really inside her all along. Terrorist woman, terrorized by the thought of an evil side to her bloodline of suicide bombers and martyrs. Martyrdom was never all that appealing in comparison to mediocrity. The average woman. Rage is relative to bloody knuckles and what it was they were fighting for. For her, Huria, freedom is relative to the laws that bind. She was bound only to her body, scarred woman. Scarab beetles stood for reincarnation in ancient Egypt, said to push across the sky the sun. Deadly woman, deep is your longing for the land of memories, dwelling place of desires, El Shams.
Thank you so much for reading that. The profound wisdom and compassion and observation executed in that piece is truly remarkable. It's just fantastic. And also, I want to give you like a virtual high five. You know, I've already read a few of my favorite lines, and that, you know, not for nothing, to go through any collection and actually have more than a handful of lines that the reader knows that's going to stay with me, I'm going to return to that, is worthy of praise. But the line, "a martyrdom was never all that appealing in comparison to mediocrity." What a masterful, with economy and irony, turning that whole notion upside down. Wow.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
How does the poet feel about that line? You're allowed to indulge me. Did you know when you wrote that, like, yeah, I nailed that?
I mean, I suppose so. I guess I you know what I really liked in writing that poem was finding the turns of phrase between the end you know, word and then the following line, figuring out, you know, how I was going to make that pattern work in a way that wasn't forced. Was difficult, but I'm proud of myself for making it work. So
Indeed.
yeah.
Well, you know, so to summarize, it's its own gift to read a collection that moves you, you know, and inspires you. But I learned a lot. I learned a lot about worlds I didn't know, that I need to know, that I want to know. And you know, again, the exchange I think that happens with meaningful art is worlds are expanded, literal and figurative. And that certainly happened with me. It happened here tonight. And it's just been an absolute pleasure and an honor to hear the poet read her work. I will, in the write-up, I will make sure to embed links, but tell everyone how they can find you online, Danielle, and check you out if they want to learn more, which I know they do.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I have a website, daniellebadra.com. Pretty easy to remember. And if you Google Danielle Badra or Like We Still Speak, you can find links to my book or to my website, or to previous readings as well. Those can all be found online. Yeah. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram. And Instagram, I think I'm at Danny Badra. So yeah.
Okay. Oh, and if I mean, who out there is watching this and is not converted, but just in case you need a little bit more, our bi-monthly publication, Movable Type, featured poems from this collection, so you can see them before you go to Potter's House and support independent bookstores and pick up your copy of Like We Still Speak by Danielle Badra. Pick up a copy for a friend and spread the word, folks. This is its own reward. It's those of us that love poetry, it's a small, intimate circle, but it should always be getting bigger. And especially during times like this, poetry speaks to things that newspapers can't approximate. So I cannot be more encouraging of anyone checking this out. Danielle, I'm so grateful for you being here. I look forward to reading more of your work, and you're part of the 1455 family, so don't be a stranger, and we hope our paths cross again sooner than later.
Agreed, and maybe even in person.
I mean, look, talk about things we can look forward to, right? What
Yeah.
a crazy thing to not take for granted, but indeed, since
Yeah.
we're both Virginians, let's
Yes.
make that happen.
Sounds good.
For tonight, thanks again. Stay safe, be well, keep writing, and thank you for all you've already given us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. You asked really good questions. So
Thank you. Well, it was my pleasure, truly. So more to be continued.
yep.
All right, everybody out there, thanks for checking us out. Spread the word, buy the book, and we will see you soon. Night.
Good night.